In this video, we're solving trigonometric equations of quadratic types. So now combining the last two types of equations we talked about. So recall that quadratic type just means you have the same pattern as a quadratic function. You have something being squared and that same thing being not squared. Right? And then we solve these by doing substitution, solving the quadratic we've created, and then going back to our original problem. One other notational thing is that when you write sine of x squared, you have this extra set of parentheses. It's kind of cumbersome and it's kind of annoying to write. And a lot of times books, when they do type sine and cosine, they don't put the parentheses, so it's even more confusing if they want to square it, because like, is it x squared? Is it sine of x all squared? It creates just a lot of hassle with where you put the squared. So the shorthand notation you're going to see a lot with sine and cosine is you put the exponent kind of right after the trig function. So this would be the same thing as cosine of x all raised to the fifth power. All right, just kind of put the exponent right after that trig function. Makes it a lot simpler to write, but not necessarily simpler to interpret what they mean. All right, but when we're looking at these equations, we see sine with a 2 there. We recognize that's something being squared, and that's going to be our clue that it's quadratic type. All right, so here we have 2 cosine squared minus 7 cosine minus 4. So again, the lesson is called solving trig equations of quadratic type. So we know it's quadratic type. We know we should find some substitution. For me, it's always u. You pick your favorite letter. What's u going to be? It's the thing being squared or the thing by itself. So u should be cosine of x. Okay. This is going to turn this into 2 cosines being squared. So now u is being squared. Cosine is u minus 4 equals 0. Okay. So first step, I do that substitution. I create a quadratic equation. Now I kind of just focus on the quadratic. Don't get too bogged down in all like the steps blending together. All right, now my job is just to solve this quadratic. I want to do that by factoring. So I'm going to have to add to negative 7 and multiply to negative 8. Notice I can't do the shortcut factoring method because there's that 2 in front of the squared term. So I have to do the full method of factoring. Multiply to negative 8, add to negative 7 is negative 8 and positive 1. So hopefully at this point in the year, you remember how to factor out the common factors. Write down the 2 answers based on what you got. All right, so that's my factored form of my quadratic. Again, you could be doing the quadratic formula in your notes if that's the way you want to do it. Nothing wrong with that. I have the factored forms equals 0, so now I can take each one and set it equal to 0. Add 4, subtract 1, divide by 2. Then I have to remember, okay, solve my quadratic. So all of this was just the middle step of solving this quadratic. Now I have to remember, I got u, but u is just a placeholder for cosine. So this is cosine of x equals 4. Cosine of x equals negative 1/2. And now we have to remember how to solve these. Fairly straightforward if we have our unit circle. It's not on the page, but you have the unit circle available to you. Cosine of x equals 4. The biggest cosine can ever be is on that right side of the unit circle, 1. So this can only max out at 1, and this is 4. So this part is not possible. But cosine of x equals negative 1/2. If you look at your unit circle, cosine is negative 1/2 at 2 pi over 3 and 4 pi over 3. And then don't forget, those are the 2 answers on the unit circle, but there's an infinite number of answers, so I have to add plus 2 pi k to both of these. All right. So very similar to the quadratic type problems we were doing before, only difference is that very last step, now you're solving a trig equation. All right, one more, let's just do it. I'm going to go as quickly as possible to make the video short, but you know the basic idea now. Quadratic type, u should be the thing that's being squared, the thing by itself, whatever it is. In this case, it's sine. All right, so it's going to be u squared minus 2u minus 3 equals 0. This one I can use the shortcut factoring because there's no number in front of u. U equals 3, and u equals negative 1. Now that I solve for u, I go back and replace u with sine of x. Sine of x, just like cosine, maxes out at 1, so this one's not possible. Sine of x equals -1. That only happens at the very bottom of my unit circle at 3 pi over 2. But again, also all of its coterminal angles, so I have to still do that, plus 2 pi k. All right, so again, same strategy, making the trig function u, solving a quadratic, and then solving the trig equations that result in that at the end. All right, so here's one for you to try on your own. I should have a basic idea of the steps. Just be careful along the way, solving your quadratic, solving your trig equations. All right, so I'm gonna write down the answer. I'll show you the answer in 3, 2, 1. And here's the final answer I came up with. Use cosine, solving a quadratic by factoring. Again, if you do the quadratic formula to get here, just make sure you fully simplify. You should get 1 and 1/2 as your answers to your quadratic. Cosine is 1, just on the right-hand side of the unit circle. Cosine is 1/2 at these two angles. And again, don't forget to include all solutions by doing that plus 2 pi k. All right, so you've already gotten some practice with solving equations of quadratic type. Only difference for this lesson is that resulting problem ends up being trig equations. But if you have your unit circle handy, those should be pretty straightforward as well. And then the one new thing, if you see that little 2 after sine or cosine, it actually means it's being squared. It's not some new function or some new thing. It's just a shorthand notation for something being squared.